everybody. This is Dr. Lori Shemek.
And I'm Omar Cumberbatch. You're listening to This Podcast Burns Fat. Hey, Lori, how are you today?
I am doing great, Omar, except that it's 107 where I live.
Whoa, 107?
Yes.
Wow.
With humidity, mind you. So that's my podcast weather report for today. What about you?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not 107. I think we're in the 80s here.
Oh, nice. That's
It's
perfect.
been actually really bearable for New York. I know it's still July. August is when it really start getting like a little nasty, but yeah, so far so good. And not a bad summer at all.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's really great. But it's just hanging in there. If we can get through, I guess, the rest of the week, this coming week will be good, I think. Hopefully, keep your fingers crossed. But there's already emergency warnings and from electrical companies to keep electrical use down. And heat and humidity, not a good combo.
Yeah. No, I'm always fascinating with like Texas, and that situation with your grid is pretty crazy.
I know. Remember in the winter, everything froze. People froze. It was terrible.
Yeah.
No electricity or gas or anything. But yeah, so we're hanging in there though. All good.
Yeah, no, hanging there, hoping for the best.
Yes. So today we have Dave Feldman and Nick Norwitz. And Dave is a software engineer turned researcher, or is a lipid researcher, along with Nick Norwitz, who has his doctorate from Oxford and is now in medical school, Harvard Medical School. And so they're both researchers in the lipid model, if you will. And so what they're researching is why people's cholesterol skyrockets. Not everybody's, but some people who are lean and otherwise have healthy metabolic markers. And so if you've ever wondered why, if you go on a ketogenic diet or a very low carb diet, such as carnivore, etc., if you ever wondered why your cholesterol might skyrocket, this might be why. And so they're in the process of researching it now. And I'm curious, to see the upcoming research. But what they found so far is extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of the times that we've had any data about low carb diets, we obviously went back to Dr. Atkins and his work. And of course, at that time, it really wasn't as popular, obviously, in the athletic world, where it's like you would have a lean person on a low carb diet at that time, especially, the conventional wisdom was you're fueling yourself with carbohydrates specifically. But since it's such a popular type of diet, we're getting data on these leaner athletes and have no clue, at least up to this point, without absent these two gentlemen's research, like why is that the case? And it's all new to us. So this was really a fascinating show to really get to the bottom of cholesterol, because frankly, I have weird high cholesterol at times as well. And it's scary when that's just been that topic of conversation for 50 something years, that if it's high, it's bad. It's just,
that's what everyone's been told. Yeah. That's not necessarily true. Exactly. It's a really important point. Yeah. So, but yeah, there's a lot of information to be gleaned from this episode. And also, if you want more information on this topic, you can find them on Twitter, under their names, and also YouTube. Nick Norwitz has a great YouTube channel where he explains in a way that's easy to understand a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, no, this was a deep episode. Get your notebooks out. There's a lot of information, a lot of terminology that we're going to have to, even myself, I took notes and went back and kind of tried to figure out some of the aspects of it that really entice me, especially because it was dealing with some of the issues that I have regarding cholesterol. So I'm sure the audience, if they have an opportunity, take notes, pay attention, listen to it twice. It's a really, really profound episode.
Sounds good.
All right, let's jump into it.
All right.
Hey, Dave and Nick, how are you today? Welcome to the show.
Having us on.
Hey, nice to have you both. Thank you for stopping by. And so, guys, today we have Dave Feldman with us and Nick Norwitz. And Dave is a software engineer. He's a lipid expert, researcher, entrepreneur, creator of the Cholesterol Code and Diet Doctor, which is a team of top experts in the field. And Dr. Nick Norwitz has a doctorate in physiology, anatomy, genetics from Oxford. He's currently a medical student at Harvard, and he too is also a metabolic health enthusiast. So both are extremely knowledgeable in this area. And, many of us are confused about cholesterol, especially we hear two sides of the story. We hear, yes, cholesterol may be good for you, but mostly we hear it, if you have high cholesterol, it's not good. So really excited to talk to both of you guys today. And again, welcome. But I just wanted to mention too, that together they have just published a powerful paper called the Lipid Energy Model. And yesterday, they were just informed that this Lipid Energy Model paper is among the top 5 most read papers for May across all MDPI journals. So congratulations, guys. That's really cool. Very cool.
Thanks.
So with that said, can you both, and maybe you start, Dave, give us a little bit about yourself and why you're so passionate about what you do?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I'm actually a software engineer. I'm not normally trained in this field. But what happened was I'd gone on a ketogenic diet. And to try to keep this story short, when my cholesterol levels went really high, I became very obsessed with understanding why my cholesterol went really high, especially when 2 of my first degree relatives did not see that happen, even though we went on the diet around the same time. So I started doing a number of different experiments, found that actually I could change my cholesterol levels quite substantially through a various number of experiments. And then I started doing presentations on these experiments, as well as starting to collaborate more and more with others. And this became the basis of the paper you just mentioned, ultimately, in that we started developing what I would call the Lipid Energy Model, which helps to try to explain why these cholesterol levels would go up and down, especially in the context of being very low carb.
That's fantastic. And Nick, what about you? You're a busy guy. I know that much.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is I came to be interested in this work via a parallel pathway to Dave's, where I adopted a ketogenic diet for my own therapeutic purposes. For Dave, I believe it was prediabetes. For me, it was ulcerative colitis, and it worked really well. But like Dave, I was shocked to find that my LDL cholesterol went through the roof, along with some other changes, which really surprised me as someone coming from a medical family, studying biology, human physiology. That was shocking and concerning to me, and I wanted to figure out what was going on. And just as an aside, because I know we'll get into the nitty gritty in a little bit, but to give you a picture of when I transitioned my diet, my ketogenic diet looked like tons of fiber, unsaturated fat. I really wasn't eating any red meat. Mm-hmm. It was very, if you look at it, the stereotypical picture of healthy. You imagine avocados, salmon, nuts, olive oil. And nevertheless, my LDL still went into the 300s, 400s, which is curious and, shocking and concerning as a patient or as a physician treating.
Absolutely.
From a scientific point of view, this was something that I found very, very fascinating. And I wanted to get to the bottom of, what's going on. So I did some of my own work, and then I stumbled across Dave's work, and the rest is history. We've been working together for the past year, and it's been quite productive.
Yes, it's been. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would just say, to say the least.
Oh, yeah, to say the least.
It feels like it's been 10 years, really. It feels like we've packed so much work in the last year. It's been incredible.
Oh, but you have, really, truly, for mankind, I would say. So, yeah, thank you for that, Nick. That's great information.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I know that you, diving into this research and having such varied results between the two of you is kind of the problem that we're having generally, that we don't really know what cholesterol is good, is bad, is indifferent. Can you dive into that a little bit to say, what are we supposed to be looking for in our cholesterol levels?
Well, so I've actually it's been a challenge of communication because of course cholesterol can get very complicated. It's often described as something very simple. It's just, it's this fat that's entering your blood and it's just glomming onto the sides of your arterial wall. And that's where the atherosclerosis comes in. But you learn pretty early on that actually it's a transportation. It's a story of transportation. We have to transport not just cholesterol, but also other things that don't mix well with water, and our blood is water-based, such as other lipids, such as the fat that we're fueled by, which is predominantly, fatty acids. And in particular, something known as triglycerides. It's 3 fatty acids together. So the boats that our body makes to move things around in our bloodstream move both the fat that we're fueled by and cholesterol. So I like to jokingly call it, but it's not entirely a joke, that cholesterol ride shares with the fat we are fueled by. And so the lipid energy model from like a 50,000 foot view is really a story about transportation, but it's also a story about busyness. There's just a lot more activity. There's a lot more transporting that has to go on if you're powered more by fat, especially if you're a lot healthier and a lot leaner, that we would posit that you need a lot more of that trafficking to happen. That's kind of the 50,000 foot view. And that's why we believe that there's a higher detectable level of cholesterol, because basically what you're doing is you're detecting more of the boats, really more of the cholesterol that was ride sharing with the fats that you're powered by. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. Yeah. And it's essentially just being released, correct?
Yes. Like in effect, I have an analogy that I sort of like, and you guys tell me if you can follow me on this one.
Okay.
Imagine that you have, let's say, 10 grocery stores in a city. And those 10 grocery stores, they're supposed to supply the groceries for their surrounding neighborhoods, wherever they're at. But on top of that, you also have large trucks that carry around the groceries to resupply those grocery stores. Well, in a balanced environment where there's enough food, then it's fine. You have about the same amount of trucks going out to each of these stores, and the neighborhoods get just about as much as they want. Well, let's say you take away half of those stores so that there's 5 grocery stores. Well, there's more demand on each of those 5 grocery stores, and there might be more need for more trucks to come out to keep resupplying them so that they can move their inventory a lot faster, right? Well, if you can think of those grocery stores as kind of like your fat stores, right? It makes sense as to why there might be more of a need for the trafficking of the bulk energy, if you will, of the groceries, making it to those grocery stores. Conversely, let's say that you have 100 grocery stores in this city, right? And they're staying plenty stocked. So there's not as much of a need to transport as much of the groceries to those stores. The neighborhood around them is not carrying as much demand because they don't have as much need to pull as much given how much there is. And it's a bit simplistic, but that's mainly to give you a sense of that trafficking aspect, if that translates well.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, that's a great analogy, Dave.
So if I could just put rewind a little bit, because Dave, I think we jumped over, describing the background, the phenomenons we're observing, including lean mass hyperresponders, which might give the analogy some context. So
that was actually my next question, was what that phenomenon, the lean mass hyperresponders, is. But before that, is people are just frightened to death of saturated fat and cholesterol. And I think that your model, pretty much settles it for people, not settles it. I want to say comforts people in that it's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
So going back to Omar's question, I think the saturated fat, I actually kind of want to leave that for a little bit down the road after we've discussed the phenomenon, because there's some nuance there. Saturated fat definitely can increase LDL. It's a question of context. But to Omar's question, and yours as well, about is this good or bad? The term, we get this all the time, is the high LDL and the high HDL, in a lean mass hyperresponder good or bad? Is being a lean mass hyperresponder good or bad? And there's a tendency for people to want to put a value judgment on these things. And while I find it incredibly interesting, I think both Dave and I would agree it's premature to put a value judgment on whether being a lean mass hyperresponder or, having this particular lipid profile is a good or bad thing. Right now, all we're saying is this is what we're observing. And we have a model to explain why. And that studying that model will help us uncover things that can give, value judgments and just further the science. So I just want to, get ahead of the concept that anything is good or bad right now. Right now is mostly descriptive and very curious and interesting. And,
okay, very good.
And one of the reasons I think people tend to traffic, pardon the pun, to the idea that being a lean mass hyperresponder is a good thing is because of the paradox that is present in the phenomenon. So for context, people are using low carb and ketogenic diets for a bunch of different metabolic conditions: obesity, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory conditions, autoimmune conditions, mental health, neurological, neurodegenerative, and they're extremely effective for a lot of these conditions. However, some people, and this is only a minority, see increases in LDL, and only a very small minority see really big increases in LDL. So what we did earlier last year and this year is we did a study to see, what were some of the factors that associate with and predict maybe who will be the people that see these LDL increases, which would be, most people would think, most doctors would think this is a really bad thing. And the really interesting thing that came out of this, a really provocative finding, is that there was an inverse association between body mass index, BMI, a proxy for leanness, and LDL change, and also an inverse correlation between a marker for good metabolic health, the triglyceride to HDL ratio, and LDL change. So to really simplify that, when we ask the question, who are the people most likely to exhibit these massive increases in LDL, which is thought of as definitely as a bad thing, it's the lean, metabolically healthy people that are susceptible to this, quote, bad change, which itself is very surprising. Why are the lean, healthy people the ones seeing this skyrocketing LDL? And then the question arises, and this is a really difficult question to answer, is how do you explain that? Because a lot of the simplistic explanations, for example, like you brought up, just eating more saturated fat, can't describe everything that's going on very well. So, for example, let's just play this thought problem. All right, let's just say lean mass hyperresponders with these really high LDL and low carb diets are just eating more saturated fat. Well, what is the implication of that? That means the saturated fat is also associating with really high HDL and low triglycerides, which is good, and associating with leanness. So either saturated fat makes people lean, or when lean people go on low carb diets, they eat more saturated fat than heavier people who might preferentially eat more seeds and nuts. None of that really makes a ton of sense. So you need a mechanistic model to kind of explain this really curious phenomenon that's going on. And that's what the lipid energy model is. Sorry, I know that was a mouthful.
No, that is fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Really well said. Yeah.
Yeah, so Nick, I like the way that's described as well. And I just want to be clear too, in case anybody is lost as far as just the specifics on the lipid panels, the HDL and the triglycerides. Can you just touch on those factors as well? Because it's definitely helpful to understand the relationship that they have when we do go to the doctor and check out these lipid panels.
Sure. So I'm going to elaborate on the analogy Dave used, that of boats. So cholesterol itself is just a building block molecule for a lot of different things: vitamin D, steroid hormones, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that cholesterol can be in different lipoprotein particles. You can imagine these as boats carrying around things in the bloodstream, including certain fat-soluble vitamins, triglycerides, which are fat fuel, and cholesterol. So just imagine these lipoprotein particles as spheres. Now, there are different classes of spheres that are defined by having different what are called apolipoproteins. So LDL cholesterol belongs to a class of these spheres, these boats, that has the ApoB lipoprotein. Also in that class is VLDL, and VLDL actually becomes LDL, and we'll get to that in a minute. Whereas HDL lipoproteins, these particles, these spheres, have ApoA. So cholesterol is the same molecule, regardless of what sphere, what boat it's in. But we differentiate between cholesterol on a lipid panel that's found in LDL particles, LDL boats, LDL spheres, versus HDL particles, HDL boats, HDL spheres. And these have interactions with each other. But the third component, if we're just talking about LDL, HDL, and triglycerides, just to give you kind of a mental picture of their structure, they're fatty acids, which are long chains of carbon and hydrogen attached to a backbone. They kind of look like the letter M. They're kind of like three legs attached to a little backbone. And the thing about triglycerides is, like Dave said before, they do not like water. So you imagine taking oil, like olive oil, and putting it in water. They don't mix, right? So you need a way to carry around the triglycerides, which are the storage form of fat, the fat fuel form around the body. How are you going to do that? You pack them into the center of these particles. So just to kind of reiterate, you have these spheres, these boats that are carrying things around in the bloodstream. Some have ApoB, lipoprotein, including LDL. Some have ApoA, lipoprotein, including HDL. And then mostly packed into the center of the ApoB lineage, actually the precursor to LDL, are these fat fuel, these triglycerides. And then what happens in the lipid energy model, or just in physiology in general, is the VLDL, and other particles called chylomicrons, but the VLDL, they have these triglycerides packed in the center, right? They're shipped out from your liver. These are the trucks Dave was referring to before to fill up the grocery stores, your fat cells, or even just fuel your muscle cells. So these big, really just imagine huge VLDL particles have these stored fat in the center so they can carry them around. They then go to their fat tissue and your muscle tissue, which then has a protein that helps suck out the stored fat, the triglycerides, into the fat tissue, just build up fat, or into the muscle tissue or heart tissue, cardiac tissue, other tissues, to burn it. And then what happens is these big VLDL particles, the precursor to LDL, they have to shrink down, right? Because you're sucking the stuff out of the center, the fuel out of the center. And as they shrink down, you can imagine if you take any sphere and you shrink it, the surface area also has to decrease. So what happens when the surface area decreases? Stuff has to fall off the surface area, including cholesterol components, which are picked up by the HDL. So there is this interplay. We can get into it a little bit more, but I'm realizing we're getting a little bit nitty gritty now. So I want
Nick, do you mind if I do just a little bit of summarizing on this one? Because I was kind of working on a little bit on the higher view.
Pitch? Last night?
Yeah. So bear with me for a sec. Basically, Lori, what we're saying is you have effectively two fleets, two classes of boats that are in your bloodstream all the time. And one of those, as Nick just mentioned, are the ApoB class, which of course famously LDL are part of that class of boat. But basically these boats, when they start out, they have a lot of lipids on them, particularly triglycerides, as just mentioned, that we're fueled by. But really all the lipids your body needs that it's trying to move to your cells, like fat soluble vitamins. It starts big and its job is to get small. And as it releases these, it's kind of like a balloon that's releasing water. It's starting to get smaller and smaller. As it gets smaller, it sheds. It has to. In order to get smaller, it sheds its pieces, including its lipids, including cholesterol. And this other fleet, the HDL fleet of boats, are starting small, and their job is to get big. And that's the value. The value is you're setting up these two sets of boats, and the process that moves them from one fleet to the next is the delivery of these lipids, including triglycerides. And that's why it does tend to show that there's this metabolic, even before we had the energy model, there's this dysregulation of metabolism you've already heard about it with metabolic syndrome, where there's low HDL and high triglycerides, which seem to be in the reverse with those people who are lean mass hyperresponders. Does that help on the summary?
Yeah, it really does.
Rising side?
Yes, absolutely. So why is it then that lean people in particular see an increase in LDL versus an overweight person?
Dave, you want me to start?
Yeah,
please. Go ahead.
Thank you.
So this is one of the most difficult questions, because what we're describing right now is a phenomenon that is based on basic biological principles and should apply to everybody, right? But we're using it to describe a phenomenon that tends to happen in lean people. And the reason we think that is it has to do with the very particular hormonal changes that'll happen when you're lean versus someone with obesity or overweight when they adopt a low carb diet. So at the beginning of the lipid energy model, if you were to take a look at our paper and you look at figure 1, which if you're listening along and you want a graphic, that's probably a figure you should be looking at, helps, then...
It's really well laid out, by the way.
Thank you. What will happen is the first step, you could say, in the lipid energy model. Now it's a cycle, but you can imagine the first step is you have to have free fatty acids released from your fat stores. Those free fatty acids are used to directly fuel muscle. So you have fat over muscle, right? And the free fatty acids are released and be taken up by muscle and burned. But then the extra fatty acids need to get taken up by the liver, repackaged into this one set of fleets that Dave referred to, these VLDL that become the LDL and then sent back out. So what you see in leaner people when they're, say, fasted is a larger increase in free fatty acids, probably because of lower levels of insulin. If you're overweight or have obesity, you're more likely to have high insulin even when fasted, and that can create a block on fatty acid release. And also drops in leptin. Leptin is a hormone that's actually released by fat tissue, as well as some other tissues, but it's released by fat tissue. And the more fat tissue you have, the more leptin you release. And the combined presence of low insulin and really low leptin, which is most likely to occur in someone that's lean, will kind of set the stage for what's to come, so to speak, in terms of this increase in resynthesis of triglycerides upon VLDL in the liver, and then this whole cycle where the VLDL go out, this protein sucks out the triglycerides, leading to low triglycerides, the VLDL become LDL, and in this turning over process, remember the surface area is shrinking, you pass cholesterol off to HDL. So it's a little bit of a complicated question, and because it's not something, it's one of the big curiosities, one of the really interesting things. And we have a hypothesis based on, analogies to fasting or some really interesting rodent data. There was one on cell metabolism by Perry et al. That was awesome. It was inspirational for part of what I just told you. But it's testable. Don't really know for sure, but it's a great question.
It's testable because what we're talking about is not just the trafficking. We're talking about the turnover. If you think about what Nick just described and take it back to the grocery store analogy, would you expect a slower grocery store to have less foot traffic of people going in and out of, say, the walk-in freezer to bring things back out? You would, relative to a busier grocery store, which does have a lot more of their personnel going in and out of the walk-in freezer, right? Well, in effect, that's what we're saying is happening to adipocytes. In a state in which you're more fat adapted, you're telling your adipocytes, hey, we're going to have you be a lot more engaged. Now that you're not relying as much on a glucose context where you're bringing things in and out of stored glucose, which is glycogen stores, you're instead relying more on adipocytes, your fat cells, to bring in and out fatty acids at a faster rate. It makes sense that your hormones and a lot of different aspects of the configuration of your body would then adapt to having more staging and pacing of these fatty acids coming in and out of your adipocytes, which again, I think is reflected in not just the higher resulting LDL that we see trafficked from the ApoB, but also the higher HDL, which we think is indicative of the turnover alongside the lower triglycerides. What we're seeing in this pattern is successful turnover. It's not just trafficking, it's turnover coming in and out of your adipocytes at a much faster rate.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So Dave, just to follow up on that, in the context of weight loss itself, what does that look like in our blood panels when a person who may be heavier and is actually letting their fat cells release actual fat into the bloodstream? Does that have anything to do with anything as well?
Well, yes, there's actually a few things to unpack there. For one, there already is a lot that's in the literature in that you want to be mindful if you are in active weight loss. And this, of course, is something that is somewhat indicative of the energy model to some extent. It can impact your lipid panels, which is why, generally speaking, we tend to prefer that people have lipid panels after they've been weight stable for a period of time. But the other aspect of it is there's still quite a lot that's in the unknown, as far as a lot of people, they assume there's going to be a more linear progression on like their numbers, particularly not just with lipids, but with a lot of other metabolic markers. I think that if you're starting from a place of more metabolic challenge, moving to a place in which you're leaner, again, don't expect that to be a linear progression from going to less metabolically healthy to more metabolically healthy per se. And so as I've personally seen a lot within our groups, some people have different fits and starts. Some people do seem to see almost an overnight change, but just to, manage your expectations because everybody's different.
So, Nick or Dave, does saturated fat actually increase LDL?
The short answer to that is yes.
Mm-hmm.
In the general person, saturated fat will increase the LDL. The thing about it is, one, the magnitude of the effect from eating some more, red meat or cream is minuscule compared to what we're seeing on LDL alone. So an LDL increase, of what would you say is expected from eating a lot more saturated fat? Maybe 20, 30, maybe 40 milligrams per deciliter?
It so depends. Yeah, it depends on the person. Like to the degree
it depends on the person, but it's not going to be like that dramatic. It's not going to take you from 100 to 100 plus. I find that very unlikely. And so, I think most physicians say, you see a level above 190 milligrams per deciliter, then you're thinking something like genetic, there's definitely something, going on here. What we're seeing is people with levels 200, 300, 400, 500, even 600 and 700, astronomically high, that really can't just be explained by saturated fat. Other things I just want to add on this question of saturated fat include, we have people eating low saturated fat ketogenic diets that are still lean mass hyperresponders. We published a very comprehensive case report on one.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
No, individuals eating like 17% of their fat is saturated fat. So they're eating basically like, olive oil ratios with LDLs above 500. And actually, it was really interesting in this case report. There was one phase where the participant ended up gaining weight, but also did a kind of experimental trial of really increasing saturated fat intake. So then there were two changes that happened, right? An increase in saturated fat intake, a massive increase, along with body weight increase. Now, standard models would say, okay, his LDL is going to go up, he increased saturated fat, right? The net effect was actually a drop in LDL by over 100 milligrams per deciliter. So in this context, the gain in BMI, the gain in body weight had a dominant effect over the saturated fat increase, which, albeit in N=1, is a pretty stark demonstration of the fact that there's definitely more here at play than just saturated fat. It definitely, for any individual, all of the things controlled will move the needle a little bit. But I think there are many other ways, the strongest being carbohydrate reintroduction, to change LDL levels on if you're a lean mass hyperresponder. And if I may use that to tee up Dave, I think, his self-experiments are awesome. And some of the drop experiments he's done, including the white bread experiment, or something that maybe we should turn to. Dave, do you want to give us a commentary on the white bread experiment?
Yeah, in fact, actually, a couple things. One,
or the sweet potato experiment.
No,
we'll talk about that afterwards.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
we'll talk about that in a second. Basically, what had happened, this is in 2018, and it's sort of funny. It was almost as a lark, because I was just getting so frustrated at people and even in 2022, it's still hard to just get the perspective of how metabolism is impacting cholesterol levels in a distinct and predictable way, that I said, you know what, I'm going to switch from a ketogenic diet to a carb-centric diet, but I'm actually going to intentionally choose a diet that nobody would recommend. It's going to have two components: white bread, like Wonder Bread, literally, and lean processed meat. Something you would associate with, like, say, prison food or something along those lines, right? But on top of that, I was also, part of the reason I chose lean processed meat was I would often hear that people going from a fat-centric keto diet to a plant-based diet, well, it's because the meat was causing the higher cholesterol. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to show that eating copious amounts of meat along with this white bread, I'm going to lower my cholesterol. And I predicted before I started the experiment that I was going to lower it to levels I'd never seen in myself before, which turned out to be the case. Basically, in 7 days, my LDL had started at baseline on day 1. It had started at 296 milligrams per deciliter. That's almost three times what the cap is that they'll tell you is a healthy LDL level.
Yeah.
And in 7 days, I had introduced a large amount of the white bread, processed meat, and my LDL had dropped around 40 milligrams per deciliter per day, down to 83 7 days later, 83 milligrams per deciliter, 7 days later.
That is incredible.
And the reason why is positive in our model. Why? Because I became hyperinsulinemic on purpose, which is why I kept telling people, please don't do this. I'm doing this so you don't have to. My leptin absolutely went through the roof. What am I telling my fat stores? I'm telling them, hey, stop, stop releasing any fatty acids. It's fine. We're in anabolism mode. We're in storage mode. And
a great example of how to lose weight.
Yeah. And I'm definitely maxing out. I'm topping off my glycogen stores throughout. I was wearing a CGM at the time, and I don't recommend it because it was kind of stressing me out a bit. But yes, my cholesterol dropping that much was highly relevant. What I found to be especially interesting was also, though, my HDL tanked. It went way down, and my triglycerides went way, way, way up. And so, of course, that ended up looking more like the pattern of atherogenic dyslipidemia. Yeah. We can kind of unpack that a little bit more later. But before getting entirely off of saturated fat, I also want to inject one other thing. There's an experiment I may now do, because I'm still having trouble, even from one of my own colleagues, believing that it's not saturated fat, where I may do my baseline diet, which is a very fixed scheduled diet, which I've now done in several experiments, and then intentionally cut it in half for a period of time until I lose around 10 pounds, and then get back to maintenance levels, staying in the exact same diet. In other words, I'm keeping everything as much the same as possible. And in losing 10 pounds, the Lipid Energy Model would predict that my LDL cholesterol would in fact increase, even though I will not have been increasing my saturated fat. I will have instead, going back to that analogy before, I'll be bringing down the total groceries in the grocery stores around my body fat everywhere, right? And therefore, I would predict that there would be a need for more trafficking. Again, I think the energy model would explain this, but a lack of increase in saturated fat, it would help to push back on that other side of the equation. And then hopefully my colleague might get convinced on this. We'll see.
Come on, Nick.
I know this colleague.
No, it's not.
It's demonstrated it with the case report now. You have the gain in weight, and not only does saturated fat stay constant, it actually goes up. And then the LDL goes down. That's basically a stronger demonstration than the idea you just prefaced.
I know, but the colleague I'm speaking of thinks it might have been a genetic aspect or something. So I think it'll help if I'm doing it specifically. We'll see.
I know. Yeah. But yeah, no, to get to your comment, Lori, about the sweet potato, this wasn't even an experiment. This was actually therapeutic. This is part of our a cohort study. We had a case series associated with it, and had some lean mass hyperresponder and near lean mass hyperresponder patients who underwent an experimental therapy with just a little bit of carb reintroduction. And the people that saw the largest rises when they went keto, they were the leanest with the lowest triglyceride to HDL ratio, same with the model. And then with carb reintroduction, they saw the lowest drops. So the whole sweet potato thing is one patient who was the leanest, it's like a 50-something-year-old man, 12% body fat on Texa, which is super lean.
Yeah.
His LDL skyrocketed to 665, not total. His LDL was 665.
That would be horrifying to find out.
That is crazy. That is like equivalent to a 1 in 1 million disease homozygous FH.
Oh, wow.
And it's, anyway, so what was he instructed to do? Reintroduce a moderate amount of carbs, 50 to 100 grams. You don't have to change anything else about your diet. No instruction to reduce saturated fat, nothing else. Just eat a small sweet potato's worth of carbs per day. His LDL dropped by 480 milligrams per deciliter.
Isn't that something?
So went down from 665 to 185. And it's probably just because he filled up his glycogen tank a little bit in his liver, which is kind of central to the model. The liver glycogen has to drop in order for you to have this cascade of events set off so that you have, more VLDL turned into LDL, higher HDL, and low triglycerides.
Yeah, that is super interesting, and really something, if you're on the ketogenic diet, which I recommend using carbohydrates every so often, reintroducing carbohydrates at a higher level, which really does help you feel better anyway. But aside from that, getting back to the saturated fat thing, it's not the only primary driver, right, of change. You mentioned that there are still unknowns at play here, and why some people have a high cholesterol and others don't. But I have a curious question. Do you feel that the gut microbiota may play a role here? That this might be that something else that's yet to be determined in future papers?
I think any question that starts with might the gut microbiota play a role, the answer has to be always yes. But defining what that is.
Because we do know that they do play a role in cholesterol, actually, bile acid metabolism. Yeah.
For sure. 100%.
I have some distinct data on this that actually Nick and I have been going through for a new paper that's coming out. And by some distinct data, what I mean is it's fascinating because basically I had done twin experiments that were extremely exhaustive. Each were 15 days long, but they were a year and a half apart. And the protocol was exactly the same. I ate the same food, did the same schedule, everything. And the reason this was kind of instructive to me was for things like the gut microbiota, in that I ate a different diet in between each of those experiments relative to what I normally eat. And so I would have thought that if it had a pronounced effect, if my gut microbiome might have had more of an impact on my cholesterol levels, such that I would see things I didn't expect, that might show up in the second experiment. And I mean, to my surprise, even at that time, my second experiment seemed extremely correlative with the first in much of the same ways that I would expect with the Lipid Energy Model, but also in many other ways that I'm still kind of surprised by, to the extent to where, I don't know, I feel like there may be an impact with regard to lipids. Certainly we know that, it's relevant for things like production of butyrate, both on the earlier in the intestine and also in the hindgut, and of course the large intestine. But to the degree with which it impacts lipid profiles specifically, I don't know. I'd want to see a lot more on that.
Well, I think you could postulate direct and indirect effects. And now the thing I want to say is about the microbiome.
That's a good point.
Indirect. Super hard. I'll get to the indirect effects in a sec, but it's super hard to study and pin down because while it's relatively stable in an individual, it also is extremely dynamic over time. And we can only kind of classify, what a microbiome looks like in any individual, but the same bug might have different functions in different people, and that might change over time. So like, practically speaking, right now, I would assume that there's some role. I don't think it's probably a dominant role, and I don't know how we would study it beyond. And I love these experiments. I think it would be super, super cool to do like a fecal transplant experiment. Take a lean mass hyperresponder.
Yeah.
So, we can see how the microbiome changes over time, but, while they're lean, let's do a transplant to another individual. Now, ethically, you probably couldn't get that clear.
Well, actually, they've done that for fat loss.
But I'm saying you wouldn't be able to take someone with an LDL of 665 and put their microbiome in a healthy person.
Oh, got it. Yes.
Giving them an antibiotic regime.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
You could probably do the reverse. You could probably get it cleared to,
You probably could do the reverse.
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, again, doing the ethics for these things is crazy difficult. In theory, though, it would be super cool. And then there's reasons you can't do it in mice. But in terms of the direct and indirect effects, what I wanted to say is maybe there's, direct effects of the microbiome on your cholesterol levels interacting with the diet. So, you eat, say, a diet that is actually really rich in dietary cholesterol and saturated fat and meat, and your microbiome changes to then change your lipid profile. Or another possibility is, you're in this more metabolically active state, the microbiome could be contributing to that to increase your energy expenditure and lower your body fat. So, for example, the microbiome influences the bile acids that are floating in your bloodstream. These aren't just things that help us digest fat, but they get into your bloodstream and they are potent signaling molecules. They bind to a receptor TGR5 to increase fat browning, to change the activity of the brain, to change just energy expenditure. So you can imagine if you have a certain microbiome and it's putting out signaling molecules to make you be leaner and burn more energy, that's going to have an indirect effect by building towards the principles of the lipid energy model, just because you're leaner and you're burning more energy. So
I love that.
I'd be surprised if it didn't have a contribution.
There are, I guess, what do you want to call them? Probiotics actually formulated for specific health conditions, so it seems plausible, in fact, that we could do that.
So yeah, I'm sure that's the case, and this is such an incredible new frontier. It's exciting to hear about all those opportunities in the gut. But I guess what happens at the end of the day, too, guys, and this is $1 million question for people who I've had interested in these diets, and they're so paranoid about the cholesterol. Is there such thing as too high of a cholesterol period like that? Because, a lot of these people are just so concerned that they're going to be put on statins, or if they're on statins already. Can you just say what should we look for and say, like, okay, this is not a good thing? We all are concerned about our heart health as well.
If you don't mind my taking the opportunity to plug the study we're doing.
Absolutely. Go for it.
We have a study that I was able to crowdfund, and it's ongoing right now. It's out of UCLA. Through the Lundquist Institute, and our principal investigator is Dr. Matt Budoff. I literally announced it, I think, a year ago, September. And we're right now in the recruitment period for lean mass hyperresponders. And what we're doing is we're flying them to the Lundquist Institute. They're getting a CT angiogram, which is, of course, a very high resolution scan of both calcified and non-calcified plaque, along with very advanced blood work and a number of other things. And what we're going to do is we're going to not only capture the scan of what they are at baseline, but we're having them fly back a year later from whenever their first scan is, so that we can get a second scan. And then we'll have longitudinal high resolution data on non-calcified plaque at a population level, because we're going to get 100 lean mass hyperresponders to do this for us.
We've already cool.
Many so far, and we're so happy and this will help answer that question, Omar, because part of the problem is virtually all of the data we have, truly virtually all of it, is in populations that either already have genetic diseases like FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, which Nick had mentioned earlier, or have some acquired disease of dysfunction in lipid metabolism, as we would typically see with, say, metabolic syndrome, atherogenic dyslipidemia, et cetera. Basically, we just, it's unfortunate, but we don't go and get healthy populations who otherwise have low cardiovascular risk markers, say the one of interest being high LDL, and study them. And interestingly, lean mass hyperresponders provide this to an order of magnitude higher. So they tend to have extremely good cardiovascular risk markers, save the one we're most interested in, which is exactly what you want for an experiment to test the independent causal relationship of the thing you're concerned about. And really, it's only until we get that data that we can feel at least some sense that we're starting to understand what the real risk consideration is.
That's great, Dave. Yeah, that's really important information. So I'm just curious, one, when you took these phenotypes on, if you will, participants, was their inflammation low?
Actually, it's, I'm not supposed to talk about all of the, I'm not supposed to talk about all of the criteria because some is supposed to be discussed between the would-be candidates and Lundquist. I can tell you the criteria is to confirm that they are not already at a high risk in other respects for cardiovascular risk. So you can probably infer from that whether or not, things like, say, a high CRP would be, eligible or not.
Right.
But I can say this, just in the lean mass hyperresponder population in general, as we would know from our Facebook group, which is now, sporting over 8,000 members.
Where can they find that? Where can people find that?
You can just go on to Facebook and just search LMHR, lean mass hyperresponder, or just spell out lean mass hyperresponder. I definitely recommend it, by the way. It's a very sciencey group. I'm very proud of how we've also been able to keep a wide spectrum of opinions. There's lots of people who are, concerned about lean mass hyperresponder. There's a lot of people who feel it's actually a very, strong profile, et cetera. But in that group, I mean, the benefit of having it is that there's a whole lot of, granted anecdotal, but a whole lot of data sharing to the extent to where we can see some common patterns. And I can say just generally, it's actually very uncommon for lean mass hyperresponders to have a pronounced increase in inflammatory markers, particularly when they're exhibiting that triad. Again, I don't want to say that as though it's predictive in that fashion. I think everybody should get, tested for inflammatory markers, because I consider it to be much more of a consideration for risk, especially for cardiovascular disease, than a lot of what you see with lipids. But, that's just
even, would you say, as far as even triglycerides go?
I mean, it depends on the degree, right? So I think if your triglycerides are above 150, that's something that would catch my attention. If your triglycerides are above 500, that's highly concerning. I don't care what your inflammatory markers are, in my opinion. However, inflammatory markers are very special in the respect that it's a signal that something's going on. And to be sure, it can be a false positive per se. For example, if Nick just worked out like crazy right before he went in and got C-reactive protein. I have a lot of my own data on this. I've taken CRP, C-reactive protein measurements following a half marathon, and they were the highest I'd ever seen before.
Yeah.
But that's supposed to happen. You're supposed to inflame your body, right? When you're doing intensive workouts. So you do want to be mindful of that. But if it's low, it can help rule out quite a lot, because like in the case of C-reactive protein, it's an acute phase reactant that's a very non-specific but highly sensitive. And so it's usually a good sign if that's not elevated in and of itself. If it is elevated, it's worth kind of, investigating further.
Yeah. Just to get back to Omar's question, to give people some practical things to look for, there are things I think we can unequivocally say are bad, including an elevated hsCRP. So even going just beyond the lipids, if you get a panel and you're worried about cardiovascular risk, the things I would look for first are, okay, what's your hsCRP? You want that to be low. And then, if you can get a lipoprotein insulin resistance, that's one of the strongest predictors of cardiovascular disease, as per the recent woman heart study, Dugani et al., I think it was. But, that has a really strong correlation with cardiovascular disease. So if your LPIR is low, that's good. And then the triglycerides and HDL. You really don't want high triglycerides or very low HDL. So the cutoffs for the criteria in metabolic syndrome are triglycerides above 150, and then HDL below 40 for men or below 50 for women. And so if you're, below those HDL cutoffs or above those triglyceride cutoffs, then that's not ideal. So, those four things are things you can look at. And then with respect to the LDL, I would say if you meet any of these other cutoffs or don't meet the ones I just mentioned, if your CRP is very high, if your lipoprotein insulin resistance score is very poor, your HDL is very low, or your triglycerides are very high, in those contexts, I'd be pretty confident in saying that a high LDL is very problematic. It's only in the very particular context of lean mass hyperresponders where, you have to do a clinical calculus between, the physician and the patient about what you do. Now, for example, to give an extreme case, let's say you're a lean mass hyperresponder, your HDL is good, your triglycerides are good, your LDL is 200. But, you actually get a functional test of plaque buildup, and it's CAC, and your score is 0. And you're maybe in your later 50s, so you would have expected some plaque buildup if there was going to be plaque buildup at this time, and you've been on a ketogenic diet for a while. And you have a reason not to want to go off a ketogenic diet. Maybe you're using it for epilepsy or lupus, something like that. Those are all factors that go into what do I do next? By contrast, let's say you're a young, healthy guy with no, notable health problems. You go on a ketogenic diet for athletic performance reasons, and your LDL goes to 600. But you're a lean mass hyperresponder, your inflammation's low, your LPIR is great. Then what do you do? Well, if I were that person, I'm not in the business of getting prescriptive, but all things being equal, bump your carbs up, eat like a sweet potato a day, and just take the conservative path, right? Doesn't that make a little bit more sense? If it's not going to really impact your quality of life.
Especially if it's just 200, depending on what the HDL is generally high.
Yeah,
but
I'm saying
that phenotype. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm taking extreme. So like I'm saying, like if you, are at that extreme, let's say you also maybe you have a family history. Like it's not a big imposition to have a sweet potato. You could even cycle it with workouts, lower your LDL, improve your workout performance. Like there are a lot of variables that go into this. So I don't like to simplify it down to you should do this, you should do that, because there are definitely kids like struggling. We have these kids, lean mass hyperresponders that are dealing with like epilepsy, and to trade in the carbs to lower the LDL is at the expense of having more seizures.
Yeah, good point.
So, every patient has to do their own calculus in terms of what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with. I generally do like, especially in people who are a little bit older, like getting a functional test if you can, a CAC score, or even better yet, like Dave's doing in his study, a coronary artery CT. Because then you can actually see like how much plaque is accumulating, which is a lot better than, a biomarker. Any biomarker. If you don't have plaque accumulating, it's probably a good thing. You can look in your heart and see. So it's
definitely a good thing.
It's a question that needs to be dealt with nuance, because I think there's a tendency to want to, we said at the beginning, ascribe value judgments to an individual marker. And if you take nothing else to from what we've been spewing for the last hour, it's that like combination lipid markers matter. Looking at things in context matters.
Absolutely.
I think it's very problematic to just take one little isolated number that might even be calculated, not directly measured, and try to make a clinical judgment just from that. You have to take it in the context of the patient's story, the patient's history, and all the other markers, their dietary context. It's complicated and should be complicated. And to simplify it down, I think, is to the disservice of the science and the medicine, if I may be so bold to say that.
So I think one of the questions that I've always had regarding just like diet overall is just the role of sugar in the diet. And I've read in, actually with the Great Cholesterol Myth, the factor that they at least made the assumption, or at the time, that the sugar molecules actually make ridges in your arteries, which cause the potential for buildup of plaque. Is that still relevant today?
Yeah, advanced glycation end products. Basically, you can have non-enzymatic, which means enzymatic reactions in the body where proteins catabolize them. So, you have a protein that makes a reaction happen faster, but you can force reactions. And if you have non-enzymatic glycation, basically what's happening is the sugar molecules are attaching to things and changing their function, damaging them. So they can damage the lining of your blood vessels. They, attach to your hemoglobin molecules. That's what HbA1c is, hemoglobin A1c. It's been glycated. And they can, increase inflammation, help with the recruitment of immune cells to your endothelium, the lining of your blood vessels, and really promote the development of plaque in cooperation with damaged LDL particles, including glycated LDL particles. So what we do know, and this is getting semantic, but it's important, that LDL is definitely part of the causal cascade of atherosclerosis. So you have LDL particles that are contributing, but whether or not they are alone sufficient to drive it, I think that's one of the questions lean mass hyperresponders provide a great proof of principle for. And so, it's in the context of things like high sugar intake, high glycation, that LDL is unequivocally dangerous. So these things all kind of interact. Short of it is sugar bad.
Well,
it's one thing I can sort of simplify.
Let me expand a little bit on that, because I think this is getting back to why I was impressing upon why I want metabolism to be considered in a way it's not been up until this point, is that this is part of the challenge, is if you think that lipoproteins, these boats, are inherently pathogenic, they're inherently disease causing, especially to create atherosclerosis, then it makes sense as to why you'd want them as low as you could possibly get them, because it's just like any other pathogen. You just want it out of your body, right? But the question is, how much do we see this higher LDL as it associates with being induced metabolically? Because you may actually be that much more fat adapted, resulting in a likewise outcome of independent development of this plaque. Now, my hypothesis currently is that we're likely not going to see it in the context of where it is due to metabolic fat adaptation, or that if we do, it's at such a low level that it's somewhat immeasurable. But that is entirely a hypothesis, and I could be wrong about that. But that said, exactly what Nick was describing, some are actually in the middle. Some would say, no, I don't think it's an independent driver, but I do think it's a multiplier. I do think that if you have already a damaged system, or you already have a lot of glycation end products, et cetera, you have more oxidizing or glycating of LDL particles, that it's going to exacerbate the progression of plaque. I think that's a little more defensible than it being just an independent driver. That said, I don't know. It's still something that we're going to need to see a bit more data on. And this is where, at least this current study out of UCLA will hopefully help us with opening the chapter.
Yeah. And it's really everything that we put into our bodies is all everything's connected. So, if we're eating sugar, we're probably also ingesting seed oils, inflammatory products. And that by not doing that, you're actually preserving your heart health. So keeping your cholesterol low, hopefully, with healthy choices. So on that note, just one more question I'd like to ask you. What about, have you tested those without, I think you said you did, saturated fat, such as olive oil, avocado oil, other fats?
Yeah, I mean, we presented that in the case report. I've definitely tested it on myself. You have no idea how much olive oil and olives I eat.
Oh, I do now.
So
tell our audience.
See his pictures.
A lot.
Yes, it's incredible.
A lot. No, my diet is, I think I've had red meat twice this month. It's actually not for any health reasons. I just like the taste of olives and fish. I always have. That's my taste preference. So I will have buckets of avocado oil, olive oil, macadamia nuts. And my BMI my LDL runs with my BMI. The saturated fat has little to no impact, nor does the dietary cholesterol. At one point, thought I was a hyperabsorber. Genetics didn't reveal anything, but I thought, okay, I'll just cut out the cholesterol in my diet, like the egg whites and the liver and the shellfish or whatever.
Did it drop?
It increased a little bit. All that dropped with my HDL.
Interesting.
My LDL peaked weirdly enough.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably within the range of range of error, but I think that different people, saturated fat's going to affect differently, and unsaturated fat's going to affect differently. But it's in lean mass hyperresponders, I do think it's a minor contributor. I think fiber is probably a little bit of a bigger contributor, and I also think, all things being equal, polyunsaturated fat will lower LDL more. But that means you're going to probably be taking a lot of omega-6, a lot of linoleic acid.
Mm-hmm.
You might have a high omega-6 to 3 ratio, which creates its own problems, potentially. Mm-hmm. So it depends what you're comfortable with. I mean, if you just drink buckets of grapeseed oil insteed of butter, I think your LDL will go down. I don't know if your health will improve, but I bet your LDL will go down. Monounsaturated fats,
Yeah.
I think
you're a living, breathing example of how beneficial they are. So
hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, guys, you've been terrific. Yeah. I think that, this is just an amazing show that I learned a lot for sure. And I'm sure the audience is going to as well. So before you jump off, can you leave us with, all your information, excluding how we can take a look at this new published paper, the website, social media handles, just so we could keep abreast of all the interesting findings that you guys come across?
And they're interesting.
Sure. Well, of course, we're going to be posting it to cholesterolcode.com. There, a couple of the paper links are already posted up, but we're actually incorporating them into the start here. So if you go there, you should be able to find that, including our information. I'm very active on Twitter, as is Nick. My Twitter handle being Real Dave Feldman. And outside of that, of course, I try to drop in and out of the groups. If anybody wants more information, the groups are just a great resource because they often can also link out to other forms of information on this as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, you're both great. Yeah, on social media. Nick, yes.
Yeah, I'm at Nick Norwitz on Twitter. I am not quite as active as I used to be. Maybe again in future. Things get busy sometimes, and I try not to sink too much time into Twitter, but I fail at that effort, by the way. It's too engaging. And then, other than that, I really just encourage people to check out the paper or Dave's amazing video abstract. He just did a stellar job on it. If you only have, it's 4 minutes, 58 seconds, and it really describes the lipid energy model quite well. It's very
done really well. Yeah. And maybe easy to understand.
And I know it's at the bottom of, Lori wrote a wonderful blog, I think you posted yesterday on Twitter, and it has links to the case report, the LMHR cohort paper, the lipid energy model paper, and each of those have associated video abstracts if you want a further breakdown. And then, I really encourage people to engage with these ideas, engage their doctors with these ideas, because right now, a lot of this is early days, and we're always looking for collaborators, innovative minds to help us push forward the science. And so, hopefully, in the coming years, we'll have more for you in terms of hard experiments, because that's kind of what we're wanting to work on next.
Well, you're both incredible and brilliant, and we've been blessed to have you here today. So thank you both. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Yeah, keep up the good work, okay?
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
No problem. Take care.
All right, have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of This Podcast Burns Fat. We're so excited to have you as a listener, and we're hoping that you really enjoyed the content as well. And if you did, please run over to iTunes and provide a rating and or review. It will go a long way in helping us continuously build our listenership up so that we can provide you with the excellent content regarding fat loss, weight management, and just an overall healthy lifestyle. Thanks so much. Have a great night.